Chapter 9 of the story contains the book of Ruth, and what we find in Ruth's story feels so different from what we read in the previous story about the judges, which had armies and heroes and battles and this big scope. Ruth is a family story. We're told right at the beginning that it takes place during the same time as the judges, during that period of time, but it reads so differently. One of the significant details that we find in the book of Ruth is the way that many of the names, the meanings of the names, complement the action that's going on in the story. And so I'll try to highlight that while I quickly summarize. So at the beginning of Ruth, a man named Elimelech, which means my God is king, and his wife Naomi, which means pleasant, leave their home in Bethlehem because of a famine. Now that's interesting because the word Bethlehem means house of bread or house of food. And why are they leaving there? Well, because there's a famine and there's no food. So they go to the land of Moab, which is on the east side of the Jordan River. Remember, the people of Israel had crossed through Moab on their way into the Promised Land, and it did not go well. You can find how things went if you look back at Numbers 22 and Numbers 25. And also in the book of Judges, Moab was one of the nations that was attacking Israel. Eglon, for example, King Eglon was king of Moab. So the relationship between the Israelites and the Moabites was not a positive one. And yet that's where Elimelech, Naomi, and their two sons, Mahlon and Chilion, end up. The name Chilion probably means something like frail person, and the name Mahlon probably means something like weak or weakling. That will be significant when we see what happens with Ruth. So in only the first 5 verses of the book of Ruth, Elimelech dies, and Naomi's two sons, Mahlon and Chilion, take on Moabite wives, and they quickly both die. And so in very short order, Naomi goes from being full to being empty, from being pleasant to being bitter. Naomi's two daughters-in-law, the two Moabite women who married her sons, are named Orpah and Ruth. Orpah sounds like the word meaning rebellious, and Ruth might be related to the word meaning refreshing or to fill. That's significant because what happens in the broad story of the book of Ruth is that Naomi goes from being empty to being filled by means of Ruth, her faithful daughter-in-law. So to move quickly through the story, Ruth and Naomi move together back to Bethlehem, where Naomi was from. There's a very memorable interaction between the two of them as they're going, where Naomi says, "Go back with your sister Orpah," because she convinces Orpah to stay in Moab. She says to Ruth, "You do the same thing," and Ruth pledges her unwavering devotion to Naomi. "Your people will be my people. Your God will be my God." We get a lens into Ruth's faithfulness and Ruth's character in this scene. Once they're in Bethlehem, Ruth meets somebody named Boaz. Now, Boaz means something like strength within or inner strength, which is very different from Ruth's previous husband, the deceased man, Mahlon, whose name meant something like weak person or weakling. And Boaz cares for Ruth and Naomi by giving them generous amounts of grain from his fields. Ruth goes out into the field and picks up after his harvesters, and he tells them, "Leave extra behind for Ruth. Don't tell her not to take anything. In fact, throw some of the sheaves out and let Ruth gather them." So he's caring for Ruth and Naomi. As it turns out, Boaz himself is a member of Elimelech's clan. He's part of that family. And so, as part of the family, he has the potential status of being a guardian redeemer for the family. And what that means is that he can raise up an heir for a deceased relative, and he can also buy up land to redeem it for somebody in a family who had maybe come on hard times, a poor person who had to sell land. A guardian redeemer would come in and redeem that, buy that for that family. So after a little bit of time passes, Naomi urges Ruth to basically go to Boaz and make a plea for marriage, make a marriage proposal in the middle of the night. This puts Ruth into a pretty compromising situation as far as the optics of it. It looks a little bit sketchy. So she goes to Boaz on the threshing floor at night, and Boaz, in his righteousness, honors her request for marriage, says, "I will do what you ask me to do. I will be a guardian redeemer for you." The only hiccup is that there's actually a closer relative who would be first in line. So tomorrow I'll talk to him, we'll figure it out, and if he doesn't want to redeem, if he doesn't want to step into that role, then I will step into that role. I'll marry you and I'll redeem the land to your family. The next day, Boaz gets up. The other guy does not want to marry Ruth, so Boaz marries Ruth. The two of them have a son. Naomi holds the son in her arms, and the other women around Naomi say, Naomi has a son. And we see that the story has sort of gone full circle. Naomi has gone from being empty to being full, and she has gone from being bitter back to being pleasant. Now, Ruth ends up being the great-grandmother of King David, which also then puts her in the line of Jesus Christ. We find her in Jesus' genealogy in Matthew chapter 1. She's there with 5 women in total, all of whom have less than ideal resumes from an outsider perspective. You find Tamar in there, find her story in Genesis 38. You find Rahab, the prostitute from Jericho, Ruth, the Moabite. You find Bathsheba, and then of course Mary, the mother of Jesus. One of the themes that the book of Ruth highlights is God's care for the marginalized, the outsider, the oppressed. Ruth is a woman, she's a widow, she's a foreigner. She has all these things going against her, and yet we find that God honors her faithfulness to Naomi, and lifts her up from a low place to a high place, gives her a place of honor, even making her a great-grandmother of King David, the great king of Israel. And the book of Ruth also shows us the theme of redemption. Boaz steps in as guardian redeemer and redeems the family fortunes. He's their only hope. He's their only resource. They're left destitute and with nothing. And Boaz steps in and redeems. Boaz, remember, is not only a great-grandfather of the great King David, but also, much later, an ancestor of Jesus Christ, the great Redeemer. So the book of Ruth is a great story. It's a short, tightly written story. It's a beautiful family story that forms sort of a small family prelude to the big national concerns of what comes next as Israel moves to unite under a single king and all the things that happen in the kingdom. Ruth is just the family prelude of that big national story. Chapter 8 of the story contains the book of Ruth, and Ruth feels so different from what we read in the previous chapter. Did I say chapter 8? I meant chapter 9.